Teams and see the recording, but that doesn't work. You have to just look at the email posted on YouTube. Okay, so we are recording. My name is George Mon. I'm a Microsoft Excel MVP. I'm a data analytics author. I'm a LinkedIn learning instructor. I'm the author of 2 books with O'Reilly. We're going to be talking about the most recent one today, Modern Data Analytics in Excel. Particularly, we're going to be looking at the second chapter of that book. So I'm going to put a link in the chat in a second to get all those downloads, and this will be left up. This is the link to all of the resources used in the book. Now, as I mentioned, you don't need to have read the book today. It would, I think, be a good idea to do so later if you're interested in these topics. But this is just a basic intro so that you have this as a guide to dive into the content at a deeper level later. I put the link in the chat to the downloads. I'm going to leave a little thumbs up on there. If you could do the same, that would be great, just so I know that you're able to get to that folder. I'm going to go ahead and open that up myself. You should just get a direct link to download the compressed folder. Okay, just make sure that you decompress that, otherwise you might have problems. I'm on a PC. I'm on a 365 Excel right now. If you're not on that setup, I'll do my best to help, but I would say that's the best setup for today. And again, if anybody comes in late asking for the downloads, go ahead and just throw them to that link, and I'll try to keep an eye out in the chat as well if there are any questions. All right, so without further ado, we're going to move to chapter 2. So you are welcome to open that set of files up. Okay, there is a solution file in here, so if you want to see something done again, you can read the book, because those things are all... Okay, somebody's already asking for the download link. Okay. You can read the book and follow along. You can watch the recording and follow along, and you can get the solutions right there. So we're going to be in chapter 2. Okay. And all right, let's go ahead and look at some basic Power Query techniques. So the most important thing to know about Power Query is that this is an ETL tool. Now that sounds super tech-like and hard to understand, but all this means is that Power Query is an extract, transform, and load tool. This is a 3-step process, and this is something that I think most of us do as Excel users without maybe even thinking about it, right? We get data from an external source. It could be a CSV file, it could be a set of folders, right? It could be like SharePoint, or maybe it's something more exotic like database, or even a web page like web scraping, right? These are all data sources that we want to get into Excel, because that's our presentation layer, as the tech bros like to say, right? This is the place that we build our visualizations, we build our analyses, and we want that data in a usable state. And we want our users to just kind of be able to unwrap it with a little bow, and it's there, it's ready to use, it's beautiful. Okay, but we know that under the surface is the proverbial duck that's swimming and it looks so graceful, but underneath the water, right, it's flapping its little legs and doing a lot of work to try to get the data into that shape. That's what this is. That's what Power Query is. We're going to use Power Query to get data from all sorts of places that aren't in Excel. We're going to transform it. This could be something as simple as rows and columns, like filtering or sorting. Okay, or it could be stuff that's more complex, like joining or merges. So if you think of like XLOOKUP or VLOOKUP, it's kind of similar to that. I talk about that in later sections of the book, and I'll do another webinar on that at some point in the future. Okay, all sorts of things that you can do to get your data into this ship state, so that ideally this data just gets loaded and also refreshed. We should say that one of the main parts is that everything's repeatable so that you're not week after week, okay, new data is coming in, let me delete this column, let me hide this row, let me, work and do all these steps so manually so that you're taking more time really on the process than the actual outcome. We want to let our users really focus on the outcome and get meaning from the data rather than just focusing on the process to get the data clean. So load that into a workbook, right, into a pivot table, and so forth, and ultimately into like a data model, or DAX, or like building dashboards and stuff like that. That's really where Power BI comes in, and we talk in the book more about Power Pivot, which is kind of the same idea as some of Power BI, but in Excel. Okay, so this is our three-step process. We're going to walk through this whole process today. We're going to look at some other supplemental tools that Power Query has to help us do that. So we can turn these processes where, again, it's manual, delete, copy, paste, right? Redo next week. We don't want to do that stuff anymore, okay? We're going to get rid of all that stuff. We want to turn it into this three-step process of extract, transform, and load. Okay, so that's how we're going to work with this. We're going to go into chapter 2. Any questions about what we're doing here? I'm going to put the link to the downloads in the chat just in case. You never know. Okay, and we're in chapter 2. All right, so we're going to walk through a basic ETL process right now in Power Query. So like I mentioned, the first step is extracting the data. Now, generally, you're going to go out to maybe even an external workbook would be fine. Okay. You would go from some other external source. But just to keep it simple today, we're just going to take a data set that's already in our workbook, and we want to clean this up in some way. Maybe every time a transaction gets logged, we just want to assign a transaction ID to it. So, it would be simple enough to set something up like this, right, where we could just use flash fill, and I'm just adding a column, right, and every time a new record comes in, we could just append to this list. It wouldn't be that big of a deal, but it's not ideal. Okay, there's a lot of margin for error here, and you are noticing that I'm using tables already. That is actually the first chapter of the book, so if you're not familiar with working with tables, I would definitely encourage you to do so. It's going to be really hard to get a lot of benefit out of Power Query, or really modern Excel in general, as almost every new tool in Excel works only with tables or works better with tables. So whether that's Copilot, Python, Power Automate, Power Apps, they all really highly depend on you being comfortable with tables. So Power Query is not any different. We're going to go ahead and head over to our data tab. Okay, and this is going to be our first step to working with Power Query. So our data is already in a table. Perfect. Okay, we're going to go from table/range. So we're doing the extract part. Okay, it says get and transform. You can think of this as extract and transform. Similar idea. Let's go ahead and just place your mouse anywhere here in the data set, and let's do from table/range. All right. So that is loading. Give me a thumbs up if I'm in the Power Query editor. Just give me a little thumbs up if you're able to do that. Okay, you should see something like this. We'll talk about what it is in a second here. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Awesome. All right. So like we talked about, Power Query avoids a lot of this manual moving your cells around, copying and pasting. It's a lot more rigid of a tool. Okay, so with that being said, you are going to lose some of the freedoms, as it were, that you would have when you're just in regular Excel. So what do I mean by this? So the first thing I'm going to notice here is if I try to come into any of this data, okay, and I'm going to make this a little bigger. Let's do a Control Shift and plus. Okay, if you want to make that, I'll put that in the chat. If you want to make your increase font. All right, if you want to make your Power Query editor just a little bit bigger, you can use that keyboard shortcut. But if you're gonna try to come into any of these cells and just like type over them, or maybe create a new column over here, like add data into a row, that stuff does not work. Okay, so there are a lot more restrictions on how the Power Query Editor works with your data. Okay, questions. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, keyboard shortcuts. Yes, those are also in the book as well. Question from Steph about how to get into Power Query Editor. Okay, let me do that one more time. Okay, so you're gonna go to, I just backed out of Power Query. If you're still in Excel, you wanna go to Data, you wanna go to From Table / Range. And then that's gonna open up the Power Query editor. Awesome. Okay. All right, then Control Shift Plus just to make this a little easier for us to look at. Okay, so we just got our data, or we extracted our data. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, like I said, this could have come from CSVs or external workbooks, whatever. Like if I go back here, I'll just do that one more time just to show what we were doing. You'll see there's a possibility to get data from a lot of places here, right? We got it in from a table. We could have got this in from a CSV file. We could have got this in from an external Excel workbook, like data in another workbook, or even like a PDF or folder files. And I show some of these examples in the book, but we're going to focus again on the table. So that was the first step. We got our data. Now we're going to transform it. So you're going to notice, just for a little kick of the tires here, of the Power Query Editor. Like I said, we do not have the same freedoms and license that we would to just go in here and start typing over cells, and we don't have that freedom and flexibility. But the plus side of that is that everything is auditable. We're going to see over here this applied steps menu. We're going to talk about this more in a second. This is really important because this is going to be our recipe. We're almost going to build like a little point and click data cleaning recipe and set of steps. Okay, Power Query is going to record everything and it can play it back for us. So if you've ever done that in VBA, if you build a macro using the macro recorder, where you click a button, you start doing what you want to do, you hit stop, and then it has that to repeat. You can replay your macro. It's kind of the same idea here. We're going to set up particularly a set of steps for data cleaning. And you're going to notice that almost all of these, if we head up here to the home ribbon, and you can look around yourself, probably worthwhile doing this after the session just to get comfortable with it. But take a little second here to peruse the menu, and you're gonna see that almost everything in here has to do with data cleaning of some way or another, right? Merging our queries, these are all called queries, okay? So when we read the data in, we're querying the data, okay? So all that means is that we're making a copy of it, we're applying some steps to it, and we're gonna load a finished copy back. That's another important step, so that like this original data that's in Excel, and I can even minimize this a little bit, you'll see that our table is still here. We are not making changes to the original data set, which is really important because if we want to audit our steps, or if something happens, we want to understand, where did that column go? Maybe it got deleted or somebody hit it. In general, making those changes directly to your source data can cause a lot of problems. So another thing that we're doing here is we're making this query, okay? And that way we're not going to write over that original data set. So this is really just a copy of our data. But you're going to notice that everything in here has to do with like grouping our data, splitting it, removing different columns, removing different rows, filling down cells. And some of these we talk about in the book. These are all different steps that we can apply to our formula. Okay, I'm sorry, to our query. So what I'm going to do, like we talked about, we're going to go over to add column, and all we're going to do right now for our first step is just add like a transaction number ID here in this table. Okay, so the way that we're going to do that is let's head over to add column. All right, and then where it says index column, hit the little drop down. Okay, so there are a couple of options here. So how we want to add this index column, I want to have my index column start from 1. So go ahead and do that. Okay, let's click from 1. Okay, and you're going to notice that we have a new column in our table. Okay, now it says add an index. This is our applied steps. We're going to talk more about that. But as you're going to see, every step that we take in Power Query is going to be listed here in our applied steps. And it's going to be really important. We're going to walk through a more detailed example here in a second. Um, Okay, so last but not least, let's go ahead and I'm just going to click. So the index column is all the way over here at the right. Let's say I want it over at the beginning of my data set because usually like transaction numbers would go to the left. So all I'm going to do is just click this and move it. Okay. And again, I can't like copy and paste. Like there's no, okay, I guess I can copy, but I can't cut. So again, but you'll even see when I right click on a column, there are a whole bunch of other steps here for transforming our data. That's really what this tool is, right? It's a data transformation tool. So that step, what I just did, now I'm going to go over here to applied steps and X out of that. That gets rid of that step, okay? Just to show what I did again, right? I took index, I just physically dragged and dropped it, okay, over to the left, and my index column is right there. And if I wanted to rename this thing, maybe I want to call this something like transaction ID. All I did there was just double click inside of that column, the header, and let's just double click it and hit enter. And you'll see that that gets added to the applied steps as well. All right. Any questions so far about anything we've done? So we've transformed the data. We extracted the data first. We just transformed it. In particular, we just added an index column. Okay. We named it transaction ID, and we're just about to load this data. Okay. For those of you just joining us, we are looking at chapter 2 of the link that I just posted in the chat. You can just go to that chapter 2 folder and you'll find this workbook right there. Sorry, I can't get you fully caught up to speed, but we're going to look through a fresh example in a second here. You should probably be able to jump in there. Okay. Any questions? All right. I'm assuming no news is good news, so we're going to go ahead and move on to that last step, which is to load it. Now there's a load button. If you go to home, we're going to go all the way here. This is close and load. This is another one where if you click the big button, it'll do something by default. But if you click the little button underneath it, it'll give you more options. So click the little button because we want more options. Okay, so click the little button under close and load. Okay, you'll see a couple of options. Close and load, that's the default. All right, close and load 2, we're going to do close and load 2 because I just want to walk you through all the options because, again, we've extracted our data, we've transformed it, and our last step is to load it. So let's close and load 2. All right, so we see a few options here. I don't like that it says import data. I think it should say load data, but what are you going to do? Okay, it says select how you want to view this data in your workbook. So again, we have the copy of the original data. That's not going anywhere, okay? We didn't make any changes to that. That thing is still as is, okay? And we're going to see in a second how we can use that data source to refresh and do this recipe again, because we basically built ourselves like a little data cleaning recipe. If we want to run it again, we could do that. We want to load the finished results some way into Excel. Now, by default, yours is probably loaded to a table. I'm going to go ahead and choose that one as well for right now. Okay, but we do have some of the other options here, and we may, time permitting, look at those other options. We could load this in as a pivot table instead. So imagine you took the clean data, insert it into Excel as a pivot table. So if you wanted to build like a little bit of a report to it, I don't know why it says pivot table report. I mean, I guess because you could build a report. It's just a pivot table. Okay, and you'll see that if we have time. Pivot chart is a pivot table plus a chart. Okay, only create connection. This one's a little bit more advanced. So what we're going to do here is rather than load the finished product into Excel, and this is probably going to make more sense once you do it yourself. If you keep reading in the book, we'll do it. Only create a connection means you are going to just create that connection. You're not going to actually load the data into Excel. You'll have the query available, but you're not going to load the resulting data. This becomes more useful if you're starting to build queries that you want to build together, like if you have multiple tables that you need to merge them, and you want to create this last step down here to the data model. If you're creating a data model where you've got maybe like an orders table and like a customers table and a returns table, and you want to be able to report on all three of them at once, build yourself a little relational data model, which many of you, if you've used like Power BI before, or even Access or a database tool, you've done that. That's what that is. Okay. So only create connection is usually more when you've got like multiple tables, you're creating a data model between them. Since we're only working with one table at a time, we could probably just go ahead and load this into a table. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead, make it a new worksheet. Okay. We don't really need to add it to the data model. So let's just create table, add this to the data model. All right. I'm going to walk through that one more time just in case anybody like missed a step or maybe you clicked the wrong option or anything like that. How do you go back and fix those steps? Make sure that you head back to the data tab here. Okay. And the queries and connections tab is going to be really important, or that button, I should say. So again, if you didn't get to this step or if you did it a little differently, okay, go to data, find queries and connections. You'll see this little menu pop on and off. Okay. And what we're going to do is right click here on sales. Okay. And there's going to be a load to button right here. So if you click that load to button, you'll get back to exactly where you were. So like if I wanted to make this a pivot table instead, for example, I'll go ahead and do that right now just to show you. I'll click OK. Excel will say this query is currently loaded to a table. If we load it as a pivot table, it's going to delete our table. Do we want to continue? Yeah, that's fine. So now I just took that table and I load it into a pivot table. If I say I don't like that, I want this loaded into a table, go ahead and just do that again, and it'll do the opposite, okay? And then we have our data listed here as a table. Any questions about any of that, what we just did? Awesome. Okay, cool. All right, I see some thumbs up. Okay, so let's do one more thing with this example, and then we'll move on. All right. So it's a little confusing because right now we've got like the raw data, right? And then we have like a copy, like a transformed copy of the data. So this one, the only difference, I mean, they're different colors, but this one has a transaction ID and this one doesn't. So what we might want to say here is like, maybe we want to call this one like sales raw or something like that. And then I'll call this one like sales out. I'm just renaming those worksheets by double clicking on them. Okay. So let's imagine that new products are coming in and we want to continue this process, right? We want to continue the extract and transform and load process. So how can we do this with Power Query? I'm going to go ahead down here and let's just, I'm just going to add a new row. Let's call this new product to call this new product 2. Okay. If you want to add other numbers in here, that's fine. Just as long as you add a couple data points to this table. And again, because this is a table, those records just automatically expand. We get the same formatting, right? This is a much nicer process than trying to manually manage that data yourself. Okay, so I've added a couple new records here. Now I want this to show up in my formatted report. Again, we know this is a pretty tiny formatted report, but there's a lot more stuff we can do as you saw in Power Query. So the way I'm going to do that is to refresh my query. Makes sense. You want new information from a web page, you refresh the web page. Maybe you've done this with a pivot table before. You want new information from that pivot table, you refresh the pivot table, you get the new data. So let's go ahead in here and I'm just going to refresh that. Okay, and you'll see that those new rows, new products get added to your table. So what we've just done here is set up a completely reproducible workflow, just pointing and clicking. Okay. We'll talk more about the alternative to that Power Query because there is some coding under the hood, but we didn't use it yet. Okay. We just pointed and clicked. We built a completely reproducible workflow. So now imagine, you come in Monday morning, you have to put these reports together rather than the wrote delete this, add here, and then you have to do this and merge these and VLOOKUP XYZ. No, just click a button and everything's done. So I'm hoping you're seeing just how powerful this can be for you. This is a very simple example, but Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say. And we'll look at a couple more examples before we close here. Any questions so far? Okay, I think I saw a couple of people just come in. Just to reset the room here, I'm going to put the downloads in the chat again. We are on chapter 2, and we actually are starting a new, slightly more detailed example right now. So, those of you who are in chapter 2, if you can navigate over to the penguins worksheet, we are going to just take a little bit of a deeper dive into the Power Query editor. So what we did in the last example, again, walk through these 3 steps, and every Power Query process you're going to do involves these 3 steps. We extracted a data from a table in this case, although that could have been from lots of other different sources. We transformed that query. Power Query calls it a query, as the name implies. Right, you could filter your data, you could sort it, you could work at merges. In our case, we added an index column, okay? And then the last step was we loaded it back into Excel as a workbook. I'm sorry, as a table, I should say. We loaded it into Excel as a table. We could continue on with that and load this data into the data model, and that gets us into building dashboards, using DAX to create measures, and other things that those of you who are Power BI users might be familiar with. All right. Any questions before we move on to our second example? Cool. All right. So we've got another table here, and we're going to start this process all over again. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the Power Query editor this time. So first step, anybody remember what I do here? Let me know in the chat if you know what to do to get into Power Query. Anybody out there? Okay, this is why you need to buy the book when you're done. Okay, there we go. We see somebody. Okay, thank you, Steph. Okay, we're going to, yes, our data's in the table. Perfect. Thank you, Steph. Okay. We are going to the data tab. Okay. And then we're going to go to from table slash range. And that brings us back into the editor. Okay, so this is the same editor that we were in here before. The only difference is, I suppose, now we've got a list of 2 queries. Okay, so you can have multiple queries, not a problem. You can even start to build queries, like if you see over here where it says merge queries and append queries. If you want to do like a VLOOKUP in Power Query, you could do that. So you could even use queries and build queries on top of queries. It gets a little more complicated than what we're going to do right now. So you're going to notice up here, we talked a little bit about this. We do have the ribbon bar, just like we do in regular Excel. Okay, except this is really more focused on data transformation. Most of the stuff you're going to do in the Power Query editor is that transform step. Okay. Last step here, the last ribbon, or the last tab on the ribbon, I should say, says view. Okay, now I don't know, those of you may have this turned on or not. I usually keep it off, especially when I'm showing people Power Query for the first time. But if you go to view, there's this formula bar, and let me make this a little bit bigger still. Okay, so what we're seeing here in this formula bar is everything we're doing here in Power Query, we actually are generating code. Okay, now this is not Excel, the Excel formula language. This is actually another language in Excel, and I think it's a little silly that there's so many programming languages in Excel. But this one's called the M programming language. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that every step we do, and if I even, let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did before. I'm going to go to transform here. Okay, and let's just do that same thing to add a actually, it was an index column. It was under add column. Go to add column and add index column. We're just going to do the same steps to this data set as we did to the last one. So I'm going to go to add column. Let's add an index column from 1. Okay, you'll see we added an index, and that actually did generate a line of code here. It might be a little bit hard to see on my screen here, so I'll make that a little bit bigger. Again, Control Shift and plus is that keyboard shortcut. So as you get more advanced into Power Query, you might see people talking about like M code, and you might have to write your M code. I would say 80+% of the tasks that you have to do in Power Query, you can just point and click, and you really don't have to worry about the code that's being generated. Every once in a while, there might be something where you do need to go in and write your own code there. If we go back to View and the advanced editor over here, so again, I just have this formula bar turned on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it off just because, again, we don't really need it for these elementary things that we're doing. If you go to the advanced editor, you're actually going to see this is the entire script. We are running a script. Our query really is like a little script here. Okay, these are all the steps that we did. And you'll see here that there is some language, and you'll notice, right, it's here under applied steps. Everything we're doing under applied steps, that's the whole reason why this is so reproducible. And again, we're calling it like a recipe. The recipe is text, right? It's a set of instructions. It's a set of code. Okay. But don't let this freak you out too much. It's good to know though, that this is a thing. Okay. But we're going to go ahead and just pretend that that doesn't exist for right now, because I'd rather have you really get like into Power Query and understand the process rather than worrying too much about memorizing another programming language, because there's plenty of tools to help you out these days. With programming, I'm looking at AI in particular. All right. Any questions about what we just looked at with the ribbon? And again, you can explore that. You could turn the formula bar on and off. Everybody feeling good about that so far? Okay. So as we mentioned here with applied steps, everything we're doing here. Okay, I do see a question or a hand raised. If you can use the chat for any questions, that would be excellent. Um, I'm going to look briefly here at applied steps. So you're going to notice, like we talked about, and I'm going to go ahead and add another step here. Let's go ahead and maybe I'm going to filter species. Yeah, another example is the book. So we'll see how long we get in the hour, and then you can check out the book and go through the examples and the recording. I think I give more free content than most MVPs, so you can check it out that way. All right, we're gonna go ahead and go to filter the data. Let's filter on this species. Okay. So you're going to notice that when that happens, like I said, we get a new step in that recipe. We're adding another step to our recipe. And you're going to notice that all of these steps get built on top of each other. So how does this work? The first thing that happens is this data comes in fresh from, in this case, the Excel table. The next step is we are changing the types, or Power Query is automatically changing the types of each column. So Power Query, again, like we talked about, it's a little more restrictive than regular Excel in terms of how it handles data. So one of the things that it's a little bit more restrictive about is that each column is one particular type of data, right? In this case, you'll kind of notice that there are these little buttons to the left of each column name. Once I click on this next step, now these two steps were just done for you, okay? So you'll see this every time you create a query in Power Query. This first step is just importing the data. This next step is every column is being given a specific type. Now, this is kind of going to rule like how that column behaves and what you can do to it and so forth. All right. So we have those two steps, and those are just done for us. Now what we can do is click on any of these other steps that we created, and you're going to notice, okay, here is the step that we added the index. Okay, it's over here. Here's the step where we filtered the rows. Okay, it's over there. So it almost gives you like a little instant replay, okay, of what you did from A to B or from A to Z or however many steps you have. For example, maybe I came back here to add an index. And I thought, you know what? Actually, I want this index column on my first, right? I want it at the first position in my data set. So I'm going to go ahead over here and move this to the left. Okay. And it says, do you want to insert a step? We're inserting an intermediate step. So again, we're kind of in between in our query. We're in the middle of it, okay? Inserting an intermediate step may affect subsequent steps. So go ahead and insert that and be like, that's fine. So you're seeing here, again, we have this instant replay. Okay, so we added the index, and then we're moving it. Now we're filtering rows. Now maybe you think like, okay, actually I don't want maybe this, I don't want to reorder my columns anymore. Go ahead and just X that out. Now there's no undo button, but generally these steps are so easy anyway that it doesn't really matter too much, okay, if you undo it. So let's go ahead and just click that out. Do we want to delete the step? Go ahead and delete it. Okay, I don't want to filter these rows either. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that. And last but not least, let's say I don't want the index anymore either. Okay, so we just added some stuff. We looked over here at applied steps. And again, you'll notice that your query changes every time you're adding these steps. Okay, but we're just using the point and click editor to look at those examples and look at those steps. We're not writing the code ourselves. Any questions about how M code works, how applied steps work, or anything like that? We're going to look at one more element here of the Power Query editor. Awesome. Okay, great. Okay. Awesome. All right. So as we've been talking about, Power Query is really first and foremost a data transformation tool. But how do you transform your data if you don't know what to transform, right? What makes data dirty? Well, that's a very philosophical question. You want to have some basic tools to understand what your data looks like and how it behaves, right? And what's in there, okay? So that's really what we're on this last tab still under view, okay? That's what these data preview and these data profiling tools are for. This is the nice kind of a hidden feature in Power Query. Again, it's a little outside the bounds of what Power Query is in terms of ETL, but insofar as data cleaning really necessitates knowing what makes your data dirty, you have it right here. So we're going to go to data preview, okay? And I don't know what's set for you right now, but we'll look at these first two ones. It says monospace and show white space. Now, these don't really do too much. They just kind of change the appearance of your data. Monospace just changes the font a little bit. And again, it's not like, in Excel where there would be like, make this column blue versus red. And, it's really not like a formatting tool. It's a data transformation tool. So this is pretty much the only formatting option you have. I don't really like it, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. Okay, show white space. What that's going to do is if there were like leading or trailing, particularly leading or trailing, I guess, depending on if it's text or numbers. If there are any leading or trailing spaces in your data, this is going to show them versus hide them. Now, there is an example in my book of where this actually matters. I don't know if we're going to get to it, but that's what that one does. Okay, now these are the important ones, these last three. It says column quality, column distribution, and column profiling. Okay, so let's go ahead and focus first on, let's do column quality and column distribution together. You're going to notice that they both, if you click these both on, these both end up kind of at the top of each column. So what we're seeing here is just a brief overview of what is in each column. Okay, are there any errors? Are there any missing values? How many value types are there? Right, so in this case, it says if I'm looking at island or species, they say there are 3 distinct values, right? So there are 3 distinct categories, basically. 0 unique. So unique just means that there's one and only one of a particular observation. Okay, 100% of these cells are valid. All that's meant by valid is that there's data in here, okay? So if we go ahead and look at something like this build depth, for example, this one says there are no errors, 99% are valid, less than 1% is empty. Now, if we scroll down here a little bit, I think we'll see it at some point. If we don't, okay, there we go. I just found one on cell 296, okay? So we're gonna notice here in Excel, if you have a value that's missing, Excel doesn't really behave well with it. There's no designated keyword for a missing value. It's really important in a lot of data languages to have a dedicated keyword for a missing value. Excel does not have that. Power Query has this, okay? So you'll notice here that when we have a row, in this case 296, build depth is missing, that is called a null. This is going to be really important when we come time to like count up how many missing values. A lot of algorithms and like reports, you want to make sure that your data is complete. That's a very key aspect of data quality. Okay. And in Power Query, we're going to use the specific keyword called null to make it clear that this is a missing value. Now, if your data set was using something like NA or missing or any other kind of keyword, Power Query is not going to pick up on that. It's just going to assume, oh, it's valid. It's got to be a blank cell for Power Query to know that it's actually null. Okay, last but not least is the error. Okay, so mostly what happens with the error is if you have like a formula error in your workbook. So for example, this BL to BD ratio, what this cell was trying to do, and if you come over to 296, I'll even click on that cell. It says down here, divide by 0. So there was an error in Excel itself in calculating these cells. Okay, and that's what causes that error to happen in Power Query. There's just a formula error in the Excel workbook itself. So again, these are useful. They're not like the be all and end all of understanding what your data is like, okay? But they're a pretty good start. And if we want to take this one step further, there's this column profile feature. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that one on as well. And let's click on body mass G. So you're going to notice once you click on column profile, make sure you click a specific column because this is one column at a time. Okay. And you'll notice if I click on any of these, okay, that we get a further breakdown of what's going on with this variable. So we can see there are 344 rows. We don't have any errors. How many empties are there? We get some basic descriptive statistics. And what this does is it's like a frequency table, basically. It visualizes how many observations are found, right, for each value. So this can be really useful, for spotting any kind of like outliers or values that obviously shouldn't be in there, right? Maybe if we had like in this case, it says male, female, and I forgot I did this in the data set, but we have a 9-9 right here. So that doesn't really make sense. Like, I don't know what that is. It probably assumes it's like missing, or maybe it's an infant or something like that. Okay, but we don't know. So we want to make sure that we can use our data profiling techniques because this might be a problem. Maybe we want to just remove this row. Maybe we want to get the data, see if we can track down the data. But it's good to understand what's in our data, right? Before we try to go through too many data cleaning steps, we want to understand what's in here. How clean is this data as a whole? So this is a really cool feature in Power Query. I don't think it gets enough publicity. One thing to definitely be aware of with this tool, and it didn't matter for this data set because I think there's like 400 rows. But if you have a bigger data set and you want to profile the entire thing, make sure that you're aware down here, all the way down at the bottom. It might be a little hard to see on my screen, but there's a button that says column profiling based on top 1,000 rows. Okay, let's go ahead. If you click that, it says column profiling based on entire data set. Let's change it to that. Okay, so by default, this profiling tool is only going to pull that top 1,000 rows. Again, keep in mind, you might be working with a data set of many, many hundreds of thousands or even millions of rows. That's another good thing to be aware of with Power Query. We don't have that million row limit that people talk about with Excel, that you can only work with like a million rows in a workbook. Power Query doesn't really have like a set limit, okay? It's really determined by like your computer's memory and other factors, okay? I've seen people work with like millions and millions of rows in Power Query. So if you're really working with that big of a data set, it might make sense just to profile the first 1,000 rows, because if you're trying to profile millions and millions of rows, it's just going to be a lot, okay? So that's just the default to profile the first 1,000. Okay, column profiling based on entire data set. We're going to turn that on, but again, in this case, it really doesn't matter. All right. So last but not least, we are going to close and load this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close and load this into a pivot table this time. Okay, so again, it says pivot table report. It's just a pivot table. I don't know why it calls it that. I don't need it to in the data model. Again, data model is really more when we want to work with like multiple tables, if we had like orders and returns and stores and stuff like that. We don't have that here. Just go ahead and click OK. All right, and then we have a pivot table, right? So if we want to define like, total, maybe average body mass by, and this is in a pivot table class. I think I have one set up at some point. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, we could just throw that into a pivot table. If we didn't want a pivot table anymore, go ahead and just come back here. You'll see there are a couple of errors. Those were those divide by zero errors. If I decided I didn't want a pivot table anymore, I wanted a table, again, data, queries and connections, okay, and we'll just load that into a table and click OK. All right. So that is Power Query in a nutshell. Those are your first steps. Now, if you continue on with the book, you're going to learn more about specific operations for working with rows, like filtering and sorting, removing blanks, working with columns, like adding calculated columns, splitting text by delimiters, looking at merges. So again, if you have two tables, how do you stack them together? How do you look them up together? And so on and so forth. But that's all the time we have for right now. So before everybody heads off, if you have a meeting, that's fine. But I just want to draw your attention to some other stuff that I have coming up. Okay, this is not the first or last webinar that I'm going to be doing. Let me put this in the chat here. So these are all of my upcoming events. These are all 100% free. Okay, so if you want to attend, next week is just an even higher level overview of everything in the book. We are going to dive into how do you set up a data model in Power Query or Power Pivot. We're going to look at some basic AI features in Excel. So it's really even a higher level primer. Okay, then we're going to get into some different functions, KPIs. Some of these have to do with the books, some of them do not. We're going to have a little bit of a break in February because I'm going to be out at the Global Excel Summit in London. I'm really excited about that. I've got some presentations that I got to get ready for with that. But when I'm in town, mostly I try to do these like once every week or every other week. So you're more than welcome to attend as many of these as you wish. And again, if you want more examples or whatever else, I think between these webinars, the books, right, like I give a lot of opportunity to learn for free. All right, last but not least is this event feedback. So like I mentioned, I do this 100% for free. I don't know how many webinars you go to, but often they hit you up to join their leadership academy within, the first 10 minutes. I don't do anything like that. This is just purely for me to get back to the community. But, I am running a business as well. So the only thing that I ask is if you could leave some feedback. I have this form. That's a really good way to do it. If you want to tag me on LinkedIn, whatever you want to do, like just get the word out there. That's really all I ask for because I like doing this for free. It helps me a lot. Make sure that I'm keeping my training chops up to date, spreading word to the community. I love hearing that people are getting better at Excel and spending less time doing just rote manual things, like feeling more empowered with their data. That's what I love about Excel. It makes you really feel like you're in control of your job. Okay. So if you could just leave some feedback that lets people know that I do that, that would be really helpful for me. And I'm happy to keep these things free and help as much as I can. I think it's more than enough to do free training like every week. I just ask for some feedback and some, free advertising, basically, in exchange. So if you could do that, that would be great. If you have a couple minutes to hang on and fill this out, you could definitely do it now because I know it's not quite time. I think that's everything right now. So I'm going to stop recording. Thank you again so much for everybody who showed up. And we will see you next week, maybe, or at a future event. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and then I'll stop recording here as well. Okay, thanks for the advertisement.